The market square is alive with noise. Merchants shout, children laugh, wine spills over wooden cups, and in the center of it all, a man screams. He's tied to a post, stripped to the waist, the executioner's whip slicing through his flesh. People cheer. Vendors sell pastries. A priest murmurs a prayer over the sound of cracking bone. To us, it's horror. To them, it was spectacle. In medieval Europe, pain was not hidden. It was performed. Agony wasn't shameful. It was theatre. Justice made visible. Sin turned into sound and blood. For centuries, Europeans gathered not to hide from suffering, but to celebrate it. This is the story of how pain became entertainment. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't carried out behind walls. It was done in the open, in the square, on the bridge, or at the city gate. Every punishment was a performance. The condemned were paraded through the streets, heads shaved, signs hung around their necks announcing their crimes. A thief might have a wooden hand tied to his chest. An adulterer might be dressed in rags and smeared with filth. The goal wasn't just punishment. It was humiliation, a moral play for the crowd. The executioner was the star. He was feared but respected. Paid in silver and free from taxes, he knew exactly how to draw a crowd. A well-executed death, quick, dramatic, and bloody, could earn him applause. Punishments varied, but all of them hurt. Hands were cut off for theft, tongues for blasphemy, ears nailed to wooden posts for lying. The pain was public, precise, and symbolic. The church said, suffering purified the soul. Rulers said it kept order. But for the people watching, it was entertainment. The one time the poor could look down on someone lower than themselves. Executions were not quiet affairs. They were events. When word spread that a hanging or burning was coming, towns filled overnight. Travelers camped outside the gates, vendors lined the streets. Wine, roasted meat, and sweet pastries were sold beside gallows and pyres. In London, crowds packed Smithfield to watch traitors disemboweled. In France, breaking on the wheel lasted for hours. Each bone shattered one by one, the executioner stopping for a drink between strikes. In Germany, criminals were flayed alive as children sat on their father's shoulders to get a better view. The condemned were sometimes forced to play their part. They were told to confess loudly, to cry out for mercy, to pray for their killers. A good confession made for a better show. When it ended, the crowd cheered, then went back to their bread and ale. Pain was just another part of life, and laughter often followed screams. Torture, too, was a kind of performance. It wasn't random cruelty, it was procedure. In the courts of the Inquisition, pain was evidence. Truth was something you could pull from flesh. When words failed, the body was made to speak. There was the rack, ropes stretching limbs until joints cracked. The strappado, victims hauled into the air by their wrists, dropped until shoulders snapped. The iron boot, wedges hammered into shins, bones splintering under pressure. The pear of anguish, forced into the mouth, twisting wider with each turn of the screw. Interrogators prayed while they worked. They believed every scream was a confession to God. Some chambers even had windows, so officials could witness the holy act without hearing the cries. And when the victim finally confessed truth, lie, or delirium, their words were written down as divine proof. Their body broken, their soul saved. Torture became ritual. It wasn't about justice, it was about order, reminding the world that pain was the price of defiance. But not every act of cruelty was punishment. Some were celebrations. Executions were often timed to match religious festivals or holidays. Good Friday, Easter, Midsummer. The calendar of the church was also the calendar of blood. a hanging in the morning, a feast by noon, a burning before Mass, a beheading at dusk to cleanse the city before the Sabbath. Crowds came drunk, ready to cheer. Musicians played as criminals were led to their deaths. Jugglers performed while the scaffold was built. Children were given sweets to keep them quiet. In France, some nobles threw banquets from balconies overlooking executions. In Germany, local inns paid for the rights to serve drinks to spectators. In Spain, the auto da fe, the burning of heretics, was a grand ceremony attended by kings, bishops, and poets. Hymns echoed over the crackle of fire. These weren't moments of sorrow. They were carnivals of faith and fear. The medieval mind saw no contradiction. Suffering was divine theatre, and God was the audience. The body itself became the lesson. Every wound had meaning. Every scar told a story. When a thief lost his hand, the crowd saw honesty restored. When a blasphemer lost his tongue, they heard silence as redemption. When an adulterer was stoned, families said it cleansed their town of sin. Justice was not about mercy. It was about spectacle. And the louder the screams, the stronger the lesson. Flogging in public squares was common. The condemned were tied to posts and whipped until blood ran down the stones. Priests read psalms between lashes. Some victims fainted, revived, and beaten again until the prayers were done. Executioners learned to pace the blows, enough to keep the crowd entertained, but not so fast that it ended too soon. People watched with fascination. Mothers held their children close and whispered warnings. This is what happens to liars. Fathers told sons, remember this when you steal. Pain was moral education, taught in flesh instead of words. The church publicly condemned cruelty, yet it used it constantly. The paradox of faith and violence defined the medieval world. When the Inquisition hunted heresy, torture was seen as sacred work. Witch trials turned agony into devotion. Each wound was a sermon, each execution a confession written in blood. In Spain, the autos da fe, acts of faith, drew thousands. Men and women paraded in white robes painted with demons before being tied to stakes. Choirs sang as flames rose. Spectators shouted prayers for the souls of the damned. And when the bodies fell, ashes were collected and scattered like relics. To see pain was to see God's justice unfold, and to turn away was to doubt His will. The church needed fear. Fear kept people loyal. Fear made the spectacle holy. But why did people love watching it? Why did parents bring children to see hangings and nobles cheer at burnings? Because life in the Middle Ages was pain. War, famine, disease, death was everywhere. When people watched others suffer, it wasn't cruelty, it was survival. To see another man punished was to be reminded that you had escaped. It gave order to chaos, meaning to misery. And there was something deeper, fascination. The crowd wanted to see how long a man could endure, how loud he would scream, how brave he could die. Endurance became a kind of art. A man who died silently was admired. One who begged for mercy was mocked. Chroniclers describe crowds laughing when a rope snapped and a criminal fell alive to the ground. The executioner would fix it, the crowd roaring for more. Children played games afterward, reenacting the deaths they'd seen, tying string around dolls' necks, pretending to burn paper witches. Pain became a story everyone knew by heart. There were darker forms still. Private entertainments for the powerful. Some nobles turned punishment into theatre behind closed doors. In the courts of Burgundy and Italy, jesters dressed as prisoners were mock-executed for laughter. In France, condemned men were forced to fight animals for the amusement of kings. In England, Traitors' heads were displayed on spikes over London Bridge, a permanent exhibit of death. Even funerals became performances of pain. Mourners whipped themselves through the streets to show devotion. Flagellants marched barefoot through towns, striking their backs with iron chains until the stones ran red. Crowds lined the roads to cheer them on. Their agony was proof of holiness. Suffering was contagious. One man's devotion inspired another's madness. Over time, the spectacle of pain began to fade, not because people grew kinder, but because the state took control. Executions moved behind prison walls. Torture chambers were sealed. The stage was closed, but something was lost. For centuries, pain had united people, through horror, through fascination, through shared fear. When it vanished from the streets, it crept into stories instead, into paintings, poems, and theatre, into the imagination. The desire to witness suffering never disappeared. It simply changed shape. What was once public became private. What was once faith became entertainment. And that's the truth that haunts history. The show never ended. It just moved indoors. Walk through the squares of medieval towns today and you'll see fountains, cafes, flowers. But beneath the cobblestones lie the ghosts of screams. The gallows stood here, the stake there. The wheel turned where children now play. The stones remember, because this was not a barbaric exception. It was a system, a belief, a culture that turned agony into order, sin into spectacle, and pain into pleasure. The Middle Ages didn't hide their violence. They celebrated it. Because for them, pain wasn't just suffering. It was proof that God was watching, proof that justice had a face, and proof that even in horror, there could be beauty. This was hidden by time. Subscribe for more stories. History tried to bury. Because behind every festival, every sermon, every smile, someone was screaming.